Side pressure. A lot of people seem to have a rough idea of what it is, but very few people seem to be able to define it clearly enough to make it a reliable, useful tool for training. The main issue, as Coach Ray has pointed out well, is that side pressure, much like back pressure, is not a pure isolated strength. It is instead a movement strength with many vectors involved, much like the explosive start off the blocks with sprinting, crucial for success but impossible to fully isolate single factors and build from basic pieces alone. Side pressure is not just a lift, it's a system. It is the net result of multiple muscles working together to drive your opponent's arm across the table or to resist being driven yourself. Despite this, there are a few simpler strengths that will contribute to stronger side pressure, but do not expect them to instantly just give you superpowers. The specific balance of forces, sideways, backwards, inwards, depends heavily on position, angle, and the opponent's resistance. That is why many pullers do not train side pressure itself directly, yet still display it well in competition. Pure isolated side pressure by itself almost never exists during a real match. It is simply not strong enough on its own against a resisting opponent. Its true power emerges when combined with other forces like back pressure, pronation, and wrist flexion into a stable, dominant structure. And possibly more important is that side pressure in combination with everything else gives the strength, stability, and confidence to just attack straight to the side, without having your hand get pulled behind your shoulder and leave you open to attack. This ability alone is one of the key parts of pulling that separates the beginners from the intermediate and advanced. Yes, it is important to understand all of the components, and it is true that back pressure is a powerful tool that can sometimes win matches by itself, but you can only pull back so far, and if the opponent can match your back pressure, what do you do from there? So, should you really even train side pressure separately? Well, it depends. Some people develop it passively through their overall training, while others may benefit from more directed, targeted work. Just like some pullers barely train the biceps, yet thrive inside the hook. Adaptation is highly individual, and the only way to know is to try. But to understand side pressure more clearly, we need a better frame. In simple terms, side pressure is your ability to move your hand from the center of the table toward your winning side. However, this idea of side pressure becomes tricky if we think of it as a fixed, absolute direction. As your arm rotates and angles change, the muscles responsible for moving sideways absolutely also change, shifting from an internal shove at the start into something closer to a front shoulder raise at pin level. A better way to understand it then is relative side pressure, pressure relative to your own arm's position and not to the table. At the start, sideways is sideways, but as you approach the pin, relative sideways angles downwards towards vertical, and when moving towards the losing side, it can even angle upwards. This shifting reality means that the muscles involved stay far more consistent and realistic for arm wrestling. With that in mind, let's break down the specific components behind strong, reliable side pressure, focusing first on the simple act of moving the hand from center to side without external resistance. One of the simplest, but potentially the riskiest, ways to create sideways motion is by internally rotating the upper arm at the shoulder, moving the hand in an arc from center to side and down. This pure internal rotation primarily uses small, stabilizing muscles like the subscapularis and infraspinatus, with some help from the chest, front deltoid, and lats. On its own, this motion can create basic side pressure, but without stable alignment of the wrist, elbow, and torso, it's weak and dangerous. Beginners often default to this isolated movement without realizing that it generates significant torque through the elbow, particularly at the medial epicondyle, and is a common cause of serious injuries like spiral humeral fractures. Internal rotation has an important place within side pressure, but only as a supportive component, not as the whole strategy. Another way then to move the hand towards the winning side is by drawing the elbow across the torso, or horizontal flexion at the shoulder joint. This movement, used in the bench press or pressing motions primarily, recruits the pectorals and front deltoid, with support from the coracobrachialis and short head of the bicep. While it does not bring the hand vertically closer to the pad, its real value lies in not initiating motion, but in resisting the elbow being pulled away from the body. As with internal rotation, its importance is less about generating pressure and more about maintaining position. Strong horizontal flexion helps prevent your arm from drifting open under pressure, preserving your structural alignment. A clear example of the importance of horizontal flexion strength and internal rotation strength appears in a match between Rustam Babayev and Paul Lin. In the first few rounds, Rustam is very clearly able to keep everything tightly inside and structurally connected, letting him easily overpower Lin's own side pressure. But in this one final round, although Rustam applies strong side pressure, Lin is able to keep his hand position more inside for him, putting Rustam's hand outside of his preferred hand-elbow-shoulder alignment and then forcing extra strain on Rustam's horizontal flexion and internal rotation. Eventually, Rustam suffers what appears to be a pectoral tendon failure at the humerus, causing his arm to drift open uncontrollably. This catastrophic failure highlights how crucial these strengths really are. Without stable horizontal flexion and internal rotation, the arm can no longer resist external forces or maintain a tight winning position. So in this way, we can see clearly that side pressure exists and, despite not being a simple performance strength, remains fundamental to arm integrity itself under load. In very simplified side pressure, it's not so much the positive movement that matters, it's the static resistance to pressure against being opened where the real value appears. A critical factor in this resistance is the wrist and hand. If your basic side pressure is strong, but your wrist collapses backwards under load, leverage quickly shifts to your opponent. To recover, you'll either have to regain wrist control or resort to brute force internal rotation and pressing, often from a bad position. If your wrist can stay neutral, or better yet flexed into your opponent, you can maintain strong side pressure much more cleanly, keeping control of the entire match. In a similar way, pronation plays a major role. It's not just about actively rotating, it's about not losing position. Without sufficient pronation, much of the force you generate leaks out through the wrist instead of transferring into your opponent. You can quite easily feel this difference by trying to move a belt or strap cable handle with a neutral wrist rotation versus one moving into supination. In the supinated position, you lose leverage, drift towards the losing side, and have far fewer muscular defenses. While basic side pressure is possible without strong wrist flexion and pronation, with them it becomes far more offensive and structurally secure, turning passive survival into active domination. Todd Hutchings is a well-known example of how deep wrist flexion isn't always necessary for effective side pressure. In fact, his style often benefits from keeping the wrist neutral or even slightly extended, especially against top rollers. Todd's approach often emphasizes raw side pressure strength and structural rigidity. His wrist commonly extends as he drives sideways, which allows him to generate more momentum through pure sideways drive, rather than pausing first to ensure wrist flexion. This is most effective when facing opponents who rely heavily on back pressure and hand control, so particularly top rollers. By forcing top rollers outside of their shoulder line quickly, Todd neutralizes their leverage and hand dominance. His strategy gains further effectiveness in the strap, where his side pressure gains a direct line into the opponent's structure. Importantly, Todd typically maintains pronation, or uses a kind of pseudo-pronation by rotating the arm and torso downwards, maintaining the effect of pronation in the opponent's hand, even if the exact rotation of his wrist is not technically pronated, which keeps pressure on the opponent's hand even if his own wrist is extended. And the result is that the top roller is forced into an awkward outside position, trying to counter a stable side drive using limited tools, primarily the brachialis, brachioradialis, and eventually just the bicep, as their elbow begins to unfold under pressure. However, Todd's signature side pressure becomes less dominant against other styles, particularly against hook pullers. This is because hook-based opponents often don't immediately try to retreat straight backwards, instead allowing controlled movement, even sometimes to the losing side, using close defensive positioning. This removes the early vulnerability that top rollers present and makes them less susceptible to Todd's side pressure blitz. Against fast, committed hook pullers who beat him in the race to a good position, Todd is often forced into a defensive bicep-heavy position, in which case Todd, being a smart person, will change tactics. So while Todd's side pressure is undeniably powerful, its reputation can sometimes overshadow the fact that he is a well-rounded, strategic arm wrestler, not a one-dimensional side pressure machine. Strong side pressure requires internal rotation at the shoulder, along with resistance to external rotation, horizontal flexion at the shoulder to bring the elbow inside, paired with the ability to resist abduction of the elbow, wrist flexion and pronation, or at least the ability to resist wrist extension and supination to maintain position and transfer power effectively. An often overlooked component is torso or body involvement, specifically pushing sideways through the floor and table and bending at the waist as you do so, which helps bring the hand closer to the pad without relying on pure internal rotation. While it is not the primary mover in side pressure, being able to hold your elbow angle against resistance is key to preventing positional collapse and leaking force. Ultimately then, strong side pressure demands nearly all the same components needed for effective top rolls, hooks and pressing. If you are weak in any of those areas, it is unlikely that you'll be able to express meaningful side pressure. So before we look at specific exercises, it's worth recognizing that side pressure is not built in a vacuum. It emerges from comprehensive arm wrestling strength as a whole. If you want a single exercise that targets nearly every component of side pressure, internal rotation, horizontal shoulder flexion, wrist containment, pronation, and positional control, the cable side pressure drag is the go-to. It is quite widely used by elite pullers like Todd Hutchings. The setup is quite simple. Position a cable level with or slightly above the hand, apply resistance from the side, and move the arm to the other side, either holding statically or dragging through to the pin. This mimics actual side pressure demands, especially from the start, better than most other movements. Using different types of handle allows you to vary which aspects of side pressure you bias. A strap or belt through the top of the hand emphasizes pronation resistance, with the weight constantly trying to roll your wrist into supination. This version is good for building static pronation strength and some static neutral wrist flexion, but does not hit deep dynamic wrist flexion very well. A wrist wrench, however, actively challenges wrist flexion and extension control, allowing you to actively curl and resist extension of the wrist during the drag, mimicking hook-style side pressure. A multi-spinner or offset wrist wrench combines pronation and wrist flexion loading, with the instability forcing you to engage more hand control, but limiting the amount of weight you are able to use, making it more aimed towards hand-focused development. The D-handle or straight strap through the palm neutralizes wrist and pronation demands, with strap sitting deep inside, close to the wrist joint, allowing maximal loading on the elbow and shoulder, making it ideal for building raw side pressure strength. A strap fed through the bottom of the hand targets supination, which is more useful for inside pullers like Muratov, Dadikyan, and Rustam Babayev, who attack more with aggressive bottom hand force, but is less useful for dedicated top rollers. Each setup, as we said, biases different strength adaptations, so you'll need to choose based on your own style or rotate variations for more comprehensive development. It is important to remain tight and connected during the movement. As you open up or drift away from being more structured, individual muscle groups begin to take on more load and become less effective. For heavy loading, it is normally beneficial to reduce arm movement and focus on more static holding, allowing the torso to move while the arm stays locked. Think of it more like a compound lift, akin to a bench press or squat. Reps should stay low, somewhere between 1 and 6, and truly maxing out frequently is discouraged due to joint vulnerability, especially in the shoulder and elbow. If possible, use a table or platform where you can brace with the non-working arm. Just like an effective lat pull-down needs leg anchoring, sideways cable loading becomes inefficient if your body isn't stabilized. Holding onto a fixed object massively increases how much force you can apply safely. One comment previously asked why top athletes like many Georgians and Todd Hutchings do this exercise with the elbow off the pad, and there are a few simple reasons. 1. They simply don't care about pad discipline in this context, or 2. They are prioritizing the movement, not replicating strict match form, since a floating elbow allows a larger range of motion and more time under tension, or 3. As Todd Hutchings has noted, keeping the elbow off the pad forces the shoulder to work hard, creating a more complete loading pattern across the entire chain, rather than relying on pad stability. For the development of maximal side pressure strength, this variation with floating elbows may be superior, even if it does not perfectly mimic application on the table. To speak quickly about range of motion and load considerations, as the arm rotates towards the pin pad, resistance decreases as the cable's angle becomes more aligned with the forearm, shifting stress from muscles and connective tissue onto bone structure. So if you want maximal load through the full movement, consider limiting the range by keeping the motion largely lateral and avoiding vertical descent towards the pin pad. Alternatively, if you want more movement and varied levels of resistance, following through to the pin pad can be beneficial. So in conclusion, if you only did one side pressure focused exercise, this would probably be the most complete. By adjusting handle type, cable height, body position, and range of motion, you can target nearly every strength that contributes to real-world functional side pressure strength on the table. Another useful variation is the table cable pin movement, where the cable is set slightly forwards and above the hand. This setup begins by emphasizing back pressure, then gradually shifts more into side pressure as the arm rotates and the forearm approaches 90 degrees to the resistance. While it can be considered as direct side pressure work, this movement functions more as a compound variable resistance exercise, hitting multiple angles and joints across the entire range of motion. This exercise, often precisely unnamed but quite commonly called the preacher hook curl or something along those lines, resembles a preacher curl but with the elbow pinned tightly inside, shifting focus away from pure bicep flexion and towards internal rotation and inner elbow pressure. The elbow itself stays relatively static and the wrist is usually just held at neutral, making this movement highly specific to side pressure mechanics at the shoulder and elbow rather than the hand. What makes this movement valuable is its ability to handle heavy loading relatively safely, putting serious pressure through the internal rotators and biceps without excessive risk, unlike some more dynamic internal rotation drills. In terms of specificity and load tolerance, this is arguably the second best side pressure builder after cable work. But because both movements are demanding, it's often best to choose one or the other per session, or reduce the load in one or the other if training both to avoid systemic fatigue or joint strain. This next exercise is a variation of the classic bodybuilding concentration curl, modified to change the position and angle of the elbow and torso to better target internal rotation and inner elbow pressure rather than pure bicep flexion. By bringing the elbow deeper inside and tilting the torso, the movement shifts focus from isolated flexion to a shorter, more controlled range that mimics side pressure mechanics, similar to the preacher hook curl, but generally lighter and safer. It is normally best used as a lighter alternative or follow-up to heavier work like the cable side pressure or preacher hook curl, although it can be done with heavy weight by itself, but it is generally what would be considered a small exercise compared to the larger ones like the cable side pressure. Standard rows train the back with resistance, usually in front of or below the torso, but they also contribute to strengthening side pressure by training the lats, which assists with the internal rotation of the humerus. A more arm wrestling specific variation is the inside row, where you pull the elbow back while also rotating the arm inward to bring the hand across the torso. This mimics internal rotation based side pressure and also adds some horizontal flexion if the torso is rotated. Additionally, this combined side pressure with a backwards pull of the elbow and the need to engage the wrist, like you might typically do in a hook. You can perform this exercise with seated cables, which are the most stable and can be loaded with the most weight, dumbbells, which allow moderate weight with a good amount of control, and standing or table cable setups, which allow a more specific environment, but the anchoring of the body is less stable, so you will also be fighting more to contain the weight. While helpful, these rows still involve relatively small internal rotators, so you will not be able to load them with as much weight as a pure lat-based row. As weight increases, the ability to fully internally rotate at the end range of motion decreases. This makes them again better used as assistance or warm-up exercises rather than primary movements like the cable side pressure or preacher hook curls. So, while the exercises covered here target side pressure most directly, it's important to remember that side pressure, as always, is built from multiple components. So any movement that strengthens the back, wrist, bicep, elbow, shoulder or chest also contributes to its development. For beginners, side pressure specific training is often less important. Early progress usually comes from mastering technique and building general strength through basics like wrist flexion, pronation, and elbow exercises. But focused side pressure work becomes more valuable when you find that you can pull effectively or hook well, but still get overwhelmed without losing any particular positions other than sideways. At that point, adding targeted side pressure work can help close the gap and reinforce your structural integrity on the table. As we have said many times now, side pressure is still not a single movement. It is the ability to resist or drive sideways using a coordinated system of muscles, leverage, and structural integrity. The more stable each component is, the more effective your pressure becomes. One of the best ways to practice and build this is, as always, by practicing on the arm wrestling table in a deliberate way. If your goal is to strengthen side pressure specifically, try holding center without relying on deep wrist flexion or pronation. While those tools can help you dominate and absolutely should be used to their fullest extent in an actual competition setting, they often reduce how much true side pressure a person needs to apply, limiting its development. Table time may lack the precise methodical structure of weighted exercises, but it provides experience and sport-specific adaptation that no machine or dumbbell can match. Being able to preacher hook curl heavy weight is useful, but being able to apply it under pressure in position matters more. In the end, side pressure training does not need to be that complicated. You just need resistance from the side, and the strength to hold your structure against it. So in closing, I have included in the description a PDF cheat sheet with condensed information on the content from this video, so you can reference the exercises and explanations more easily. But if you have any other ideas for methods or exercises, or if you don't agree with any of this, then it would be useful if you could put that in the comments so that others can benefit from this information too. But that's it, and I'll see you next time.